November 1934. A decorated Marine Corps general walks into a congressional hearing room and tells lawmakers something almost impossible to believe. According to Major General Smedley Butler, some of the wealthiest businessmen in America had approached him with an extraordinary proposal. They wanted him to lead an army of 500,000 veterans, march on Washington, remove President Franklin Delano Roosevelt from power, and replace America's elected government with something resembling the fascist government rising across Europe. Newspapers laughed, Wall Street denied everything, no one was ever prosecuted. Yet Congress would later conclude that the plot had indeed been discussed and planned. This is the story of what became known as the business plot, or the Wall Street push. America on the brink. To understand why such a story was even plausible, you have to understand the America of the early 1930s. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed. What began as a financial panic became an economic catastrophe. Within a few years, unemployment approached 25%. Thousands of banks failed. Families lost savings overnight. Bread lines stretched for blocks, foreclosures emptied neighborhoods, and across the country a deep embittered distrust of Wall Street took hold. America had never experienced an economic collapse on this scale. Many Americans believed capitalism itself had failed, and they were not alone in that fear. Around the world, democracy was beginning to crack. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had consolidated power under fascism. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were rapidly gaining strength. Across Europe, many wealthy industrialists looked at authoritarian governments and saw something preferable to the alternative they feared most: socialism, communism, and the collapse of private property. America was not immune to those fears. The same debates raging in Berlin and Rome about order, authority, and the limits of democracy were echoing in boardrooms and country clubs from New York to Chicago. The question was not whether America was in crisis. The question was what kind of country would emerge from it. Into that crisis stepped a group of men who would become central to this story: American veterans of the First World War. In 1924, Congress passed the World War Adjusted Compensation Act, often called the Bonus Act. It promised veterans compensation for their wartime service, but there was a catch. Instead of immediate cash, veterans received certificates. Payment was not due until 1945. By 1932, with the Depression in full force, many veterans could not wait 13 more years. They needed help now. That summer, roughly 17,000 veterans, along with their families, marched on Washington. They called themselves the Bonus Army. They built encampments near the Capitol. They demanded that Congress pay what they had been promised. The nation watched, and one man watched with particular intensity: Major General Smedley Butler. Butler was not an ordinary figure. He was one of the most celebrated Marines in American history. A two-time recipient of the Medal of Honor, he had fought in the Philippines, in China, in Central America, and France. Among veterans, his word carried enormous weight. But by the 1930s, Butler was changing. He had grown increasingly critical of Wall Street and of what he saw as wars fought for corporate profit rather than national defense. Years later, he would publish a famous pamphlet titled "War is a Racket." In 1932, Butler publicly supported the Bonus Army. He understood the anger. He shared it. President Herbert Hoover saw the encampments differently. He ordered the camps cleared. On July 28, 1932, General Douglas MacArthur, backed by troops, cavalry, tanks, and tear gas, drove the veterans from Washington. The images shocked the country. A government sending the army against its own former soldiers became one of the defining moments of Hoover's presidency, in a wound that would not quickly heal. When businessmen 2 years later looked for someone who could mobilize veterans, there was one name that stood above all others: Smedley Butler. The plot forms. By the time Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in as the 32nd President of the United States on March 4, 1933, America was in crisis. 4 years of economic collapse had left the country battered. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans were unemployed. Thousands of banks had failed. Families had lost their homes. Businesses had shattered. Millions questioned whether the American economic system itself could survive. Roosevelt entered office with a promise unlike any president before him. During his campaign, he pledged a New Deal for the American people, a sweeping series of government programs designed to provide relief for the unemployed, stimulate economic recovery, and reform the financial system to prevent another collapse. Within days of taking office, Roosevelt declared a nationwide bank holiday, temporarily closing every bank in the country while federal inspectors determined which institutions remained solvent. Congress quickly passed the Emergency Banking Act, restoring confidence in the nation's financial system. In the months that followed came an unprecedented expansion of the federal government. Agencies like the Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work building roads, bridges, and national parks. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration attempted to stabilize farm prices, while the National Recovery Administration sought to coordinate wages, prices, and industrial production. Within days of taking office, Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday, temporarily closing every bank in the country while federal inspectors determined which institutions remained solvent. Congress quickly passed the Emergency Banking Act, restoring confidence in the nation's financial system. In the months that followed came an unprecedented expansion of the federal government. Agencies like the Civilian Conservation Corps To millions of ordinary Americans, Roosevelt was saving the country. To others, he represented something far more dangerous. Many influential bankers, financiers, and industrialists viewed the New Deal as a direct assault on free enterprise. Roosevelt had abandoned the traditional gold standard, increased federal regulation, strengthened labor unions, and expanded Washington's role in the economy to a degree previously unimaginable in American history. Critics argued that these policies threatened individual liberty and undermined the foundations of American capitalism. The fear was not simply economic, it was ideological. Across Europe, democratic governments were struggling to survive. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had established a fascist state more than a decade earlier. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had become chancellor in January 1933 and was rapidly consolidating power. To many observers around the world, authoritarian governments appeared capable of acting decisively, while democracies seemed slow, divided, and ineffective. Some American businessmen admired aspects of these governments, not necessarily their brutality, but their ability to suppress labor unrest, maintain social order, and coordinate industry within the state. They feared that Roosevelt's reforms would embolden organized labor and permanently shift power away from business leaders. Within this atmosphere of uncertainty, that one Wall Street bond salesman entered the story. His name was Gerald McGuire. McGuire worked for the brokerage firm Grayson M.P. Murphy and Company, an investment house headed by Grayson Murphy, a wealthy financier, decorated veteran, and prominent figure in New York's business community. Murphy maintained connections with influential banking and industrial circles and had served on several major corporate boards. While Murphy would later deny any involvement in a conspiracy, his firm's employees would become the central figure in one of the most controversial allegations in modern American political history. During the summer of 1933, McGuire began visiting Major General Smedley Butler. At first, the conversations appeared harmless. McGuire claimed to be interested in veterans affairs, particularly the American Legion, one of the nation's largest organizations representing former servicemen. Butler, whose outspoken support for veterans had made him enormously popular among former soldiers, seemed like the ideal person to consult. The meeting continued. Slowly, the discussion shifted away from veterans' benefits and towards politics. According to Butler's later testimony, McGuire began describing the possibility of organizing an enormous force of ex-servicemen, hundreds of thousands of veterans united under a single leader. That leader, McGuire suggested, should be Butler himself. It was an unusual proposal, but Butler initially listened without revealing his concerns. As one of the most decorated Marines in American history, he commanded immense respect among veterans across the country. If anyone could mobilize former soldiers into a national political movement, it was Smedley Butler. Then the proposal became even more extraordinary. McGuire allegedly explained that Roosevelt should remain president in name only, rather than removing him outright. Real executive authority would be transferred to a newly created government position, something McGuire referred to as Secretary of General Affairs. Officially, Roosevelt would continue serving as the nation's symbolic leader. Unofficially, someone else would exercise the real power of government. McGuire reportedly argued that Roosevelt was overworked and physically incapable of managing the responsibilities of the presidency due to the effects of polio. The new office, he suggested, would simply assist the president with burdens of governing. Butler, however, believed this explanation concealed a far more significant objective: stripping the elected president of his authority while preserving the appearance of constitutional government. The concept bore striking similarities to political developments already unfolding overseas. In several European nations, democratic institutions had not disappeared overnight. Instead, power had gradually concentrated in the hands of unelected figures who exercised authority behind the scenes, while existing governments remained as little more than ceremonial facades. Butler began to suspect that he was being recruited for something much larger than a veterans organization. Rather than confronting McGuire immediately, Butler decided to continue the conversations. If there truly was an organized effort to reshape the American government, he wanted evidence, not rumors. To help verify McGuire's intentions, Butler enlisted the assistance of journalist Paul Comley French. Unlike Butler, French approached the meeting as an independent observer. When he later spoke with McGuire, French claimed the Wall Street broker openly praised the fascist movement emerging across Europe. According to French, McGuire argued that organizations composed of military veterans had become the backbone of successful authoritarian governments abroad, and suggested that the United States might benefit from adopting a similar model. French's account proved significant because it appeared to corroborate a key element of Butler's story. It was no longer simply one man's allegation against another. An experienced journalist was now describing conversations that closely mirrored Butler's own recollections. Meanwhile, McGuire continued traveling extensively, including a trip through Europe where he observed fascist veterans organizations firsthand. Upon returning to the United States, Butler later testified that McGuire seemed even more convinced that such movements offered a blueprint for America's future. By late 1934, Butler believed he had heard enough. The conversations had moved far beyond politics. If his account was true, influential individuals connected to Wall Street were attempting to recruit one of America's most respected military leaders to organize a mass movement capable of pressuring, perhaps even controlling, the federal government. Rather than accepting the proposal, Butler made a very different decision. He would take his story to Congress. The allegations that followed would become one of the most extraordinary testimonies ever delivered before a congressional committee, and would ignite a controversy that historians continue to debate nearly a century later. The congressional investigation. On November 20th, 1934, Major General Smedley Butler appeared before the McCormack-Dickstein Committee, officially known as the Special Committee on Un-American Activities, authorized to investigate Nazi propaganda and certain other propaganda activities. Created earlier that year by the House of Representatives, the committee was tasked with examining foreign propaganda and extremist political movements operating within the United States. What Butler told the committee immediately captured national attention. Speaking under oath, Butler testified that he had been approached by Gerald McGuire, a Wall Street bond salesman employed by Grayson, Murphy and Company. According to Butler, McGuire was not acting alone. He claimed to represent the interests of wealthy businessmen who believed President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal threatened the future of American capitalism. But Butler explained that McGuire's proposal had not been presented all at once. Instead, it unfolded gradually over several meetings, beginning with discussions of veterans organizations before evolving into something far more ambitious. The central idea, Butler testified, was to create an organization of approximately 500,000 World War I veterans. The movement would be publicly portrayed as patriotic and dedicated to protecting the nation, but its true purpose would be political. Butler's popularity among veterans made him the ideal figure to lead such an organization. According to his testimony, McGuire believed that if enough veterans could be organized under Butler's command, they would possess enormous political influence. Whether through a massive demonstration in Washington or the implied threat of force, the movement would pressure President Roosevelt into surrendering much of his executive authority. The president Butler claimed would remain in office, but real power would pass to a newly created position called the Secretary of General Affairs. McGuire allegedly argued that Roosevelt's physical disability made him incapable of handling the demands of presidency and that appointing a powerful administrator would merely ease the burden of governing. Butler rejected that explanation. To him, the proposal amounted to replacing constitutional government with rule by an unelected executive backed by political pressure from a privately organized army. Butler also described McGuire's fascination with the political developments taking place in Europe. During his testimony, he explained that McGuire had traveled overseas to study organizations composed of military veterans, particularly those operating in Italy and France. According to Butler, McGuire returned convinced that similar organizations could stabilize American politics while protecting business interests from labor unrest and what many conservatives viewed as the growing influence of socialism. The committee questioned Butler extensively. Members repeatedly asked whether he believed McGuire genuinely represented influential financial interests or was merely speaking for himself. Butler insisted he believed McGuire was acting on behalf of others. He identified several prominent individuals whose names had arisen during conversation, including financier Grayson and P. Murphy and American Legion commander William Doyle. Butler also mentioned Robert Sterling Clark, heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune, whom he believed had expressed sympathy for elements of the proposal. However, Butler acknowledged that his knowledge of these men's involvement varied considerably. In some cases, he had direct conversations. In others, their names had been introduced by McGuire. As Butler's testimony became public, the committee called additional witnesses. Gerald McGuire appeared before Congress and categorically denied Butler's allegations. He admitted meeting with Butler numerous times but insisted the conversations concerned veterans issues, the gold standard, and political reform, not a coup. McGuire denied advocating fascism, denied proposing an army of veterans, and denied attempting to remove Roosevelt from power. Other individuals named by Butler similarly rejected any involvement. Some argued the entire story was absurd. Others refused to comment publicly. One of the most important witnesses, however, was journalist Paul Calmly French. French testified that he had independently met with McGuire after Butler became suspicious of the proposals. According to French, McGuire spoke openly about European fascist movements and suggested that organizations of veterans had become effective political instruments abroad. French's testimony did not independently prove that a coup was imminent, but it supported Butler's claim that McGuire admired aspects of the authoritarian systems then emerging in Europe. The committee spent weeks reviewing testimony, correspondence, financial records, and witness statements. Not every allegation could be confirmed. Some of Butler's claims rested primarily on his recollection of private conversations. Several of the wealthy businessmen he believed were connected to the scheme denied participating, and investigators found little documentary evidence tying them directly to an organized conspiracy. Yet, the committee did not dismiss Butler's testimony outright. When its final report was issued, it reached a conclusion that surprised many observers. The committee stated, "There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient." The report stopped well short of declaring that an armed coup was imminent. It did not identify a complete chain of command, nor did it recommend criminal prosecutions. Nevertheless, Congress concluded that Butler's allegations could not simply be written off as fiction. At least some effort to recruit Butler into an anti-Roosevelt movement had taken place. Despite the committee's findings, much of the American press remained deeply skeptical. Some newspapers ridiculed Butler almost immediately after his testimony became public. The New York Times famously characterized the allegations as little more than a gigantic hoax. Editorial writers argued that the notion of prominent Wall Street financiers organizing a fascist revolution in the United States bordered on fantasy. Others took a more cautious position. While acknowledging that Butler's story sounded extraordinary, they noted that the congressional committee had not dismissed his testimony and had in fact found evidence that discussions had occurred. The public was left with two competing narratives. One portrayed Butler as a patriotic military hero who had exposed a dangerous threat to American democracy before it could develop any further. The other depicted him as a well-meaning but overly suspicious retired general who had mistaken political conversations for an organized conspiracy. Controversy only deepened a few months later. Investigative journalist John L. Spivak obtained portions of testimony that had not appeared in the committee's published record. Writing for the left-wing magazine New Masses, Spivak argued that the committee had softened its findings and omitted references to additional wealthy financiers. His articles fueled accusations that powerful interests had successfully limited the scope of the investigation. Whether Spivak's conclusions were justified remains a matter of debate. Historians generally agree that his reporting reflected his own political perspective, and many of his broader claims extend beyond what the committee itself concluded. Nevertheless, his work ensured that the business plot would remain part of the public conversation long after the hearing's order. Then in March 1935, one of the central figures in Butler's stories unexpectedly died. On March 25th, Gerald McGuire succumbed to pneumonia at the age of just 37. His death abruptly ended any possibility of further testimony or cross-examination. For supporters of Butler's account, McGuire's passing meant that the man accused of recruiting the journal would never again publicly explain his action. For skeptics, it meant one of the principal witnesses capable of challenging Butler's version of events was gone. The hearings had concluded. No indictments were issued. No criminal trials followed. Yet Congress had acknowledged that conversations about such a plan had taken place. Whether those conversations represented an unrealized coup, political fantasy, or something in between would become one of the most enduring historical debates of the 20th century America.